Chapter 12. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1731 to 1803. During the period of gloom and inaction that immediately followed the death of Osei Tutu, XII and Denkera, encouraged by the successful resistance that had been offered by the Yakims, had revolted and joined them, and it was Osei Opoku's first care to resubdue these tribes and restore the power of Ashanti to its former position. To this end, Akim was once more invaded, and, together with Asin, utterly reduced, after which Denkera was also reoccupied. With the conquest of Akim, some additional notes came into the hands of the Ashantis. These were the notes for the Accra forts and Christiansborg Castle, which had originally been issued to the local chiefs by the English, Dutch and Danes, but had subsequently been captured by the Yakims. Dagomba, Gonja, and Brong were next invaded. They were defeated in the first engagement, and soon found that in spite of their superior numbers and some slight successes obtained by their cavalry, they were handicapped by want of firearms and had no hope of ultimate victory. Their trade, moreover, was being ruined by the war, and peace was therefore made upon these tribes giving an undertaking to pay a yearly tribute to Kumasi. In this campaign, the Ashanti army first crossed the Volta at Krachi, and having subdued Dagomba and Gonja, recrossed it at Yeji, which at once submitted. Though Prang offered some feeble resistance, it was quickly subdued, but when Dawiya, the king of Atabubu, was summoned to acknowledge the suzerainty of Kumasi, he refused, and was killed in the engagement that followed. Jaman, Buromi, Inter, and Tekiman were soon afterwards reduced, for the purpose of the war against Amio, the king of Tekiman. Opoku entered into an alliance with Bafu Pim, the king of Ikaranza, which was really a Brong kingdom. This alliance was afterwards continued, and the Ashantis thereby gained by diplomacy what they could otherwise only have obtained by force, for, from being an ally, Ikaranza gradually became an Ashanti province. Opoku now enacted a new code of laws, but as these had a tendency to diminish the individual power of the chiefs and to convert the government from an aristocracy into a personal despotism, the latter began to intrigue against him, and a dangerous conspiracy was quickly formed. News of this reached Opoku, who fled by night to Jabin, where he tried to convene a meeting for the discussion and settlement of the dispute. Some of his enemies, however, had already taken action and were in open armed rebellion, so that he too was compelled to collect his adherents and oppose force with force. The rebels were utterly defeated near Dinkeni, and the king then returned to Kumasi, where the friends of those conspirators who had escaped the slaughter interceded on their behalf and ultimately obtained their pardon. Opoku did not long survive these events, but in 1742 was taken suddenly ill while sitting in the council and expired as his attendants were removing him. Opoku was succeeded by another brother, Osei Kwesi, also known as Kwesi Bodom, whose installment was made conditional on the revocation of the obnoxious laws and the restoration of the old constitution. Early in his reign, Akim, Buromi, and Kwahu rebelled at the instigation of the king of Dahomey, who promised to send an army to their support. They mobilized their forces in Kwahu, near the Volta, expecting that the Dahomeys would soon cross the river and join them. Kwesi, however, fell upon and utterly defeated them before their preparations were completed or their allies had arrived. the kings of Buromi and Kwahu were taken prisoners, and the king of Akim, though he escaped at the time, soon found himself hard-pressed and blew himself and all his principal chiefs up with a barrel of gunpowder, together with most of his wives and children. XII next crossed the Volta to take his revenge on the Dahomies for the injury they had done him. 2 days later, news of the enemy's approach was received in the Ashanti camp, and a terrible battle ensued, which lasted until nightfall without either side being able to claim any material advantage. But the next morning, when the king wished to renew the conflict, the fetish priests declared the omens were not propitious, and the attack was therefore postponed. The Dahomies naturally attributed the inactivity of the Ashantis to want of resolution, and themselves advanced, whereupon XII ordered a precipitate retreat to the Volta, which he recrossed, but owing to the small number of canoes available, a great many of his men were still on the opposite bank when the enemy came up with them. They were thus compelled to make a stand against an immensely superior force, and suffered very heavy losses. On the arrival of the defeated army in Kumasi, enormous numbers of prisoners were sacrificed during the funeral customs of the fallen chiefs, and every tributary province was called upon to furnish supplies of victims. It took the Ashantis some time to recover from this disastrous campaign, but an expedition was then undertaken against Banda, in which XII received a wound which, though he lingered for some months, proved fatal in 1752. The Ashantis, and in fact all the Akan tribes, traced their descent through the female line. They thus ensure the preservation of the blood royal, for it is but seldom that the king's wives are themselves of the royal family, and consequently, should they prove faithless, the strain would be entirely lost in their sons, whereas it is of necessity preserved in the sons of the princesses. Another reason that is given by the Ashantis for the existence of this rule is that it was essential for so warlike a race to make some arrangement whereby the heir to the stool should usually have reached years of discretion. Had the reigning monarch been killed in battle and the stool descended to his son, a long regency might often have been involved, whereas by adopting a law of succession through the brothers and nephews, the risk was reduced to a minimum. In the absence of a brother, therefore, the heir apparent is the king's sister's son, or next relative traceable through the female line, and on the death of XII, his nephew Kujo succeeded to the stool. Several of the dependent provinces had taken advantage of the war with Banda and the subsequent illness and death of the king to avoid payment of the customary tribute, and Osai Kujo now sent to demand it. They first tried to excuse themselves on the ground that the late king's death had prevented their receiving a share of any plunder that might have been obtained in the war in which they had fought under him, but finding that payment would be enforced, the king of Jaman openly revolted and was quickly joined by those of Denkera, Wasau, and Tufel, and by some auxiliary cavalry from Kong and Gofan. The struggle that followed taxed the resources of the Ashantis to the utmost. Twice the king invaded Jaman, only to be driven back with heavy losses. He then returned to Kumasi to consult the fetish, but finding the omens still favourable, at once led a third expedition against the enemy and gained a complete victory. Great numbers of prisoners were brought back to Kumasi, where all the principal rebels were sacrificed, but their children and the women were spared to make good the heavy losses that had been incurred by the army. Those adults who escaped sacrifice and many of the women were sent to the great slave mart at Mansu, where they were sold to the coast brokers to be afterwards transported to the West Indies. Expeditions were then sent to confirm the subjection of Banda, Wassaw, Akim, and Aquapim. The subjugation of Jaman had laid open all the country beyond to the attack of the Ashantis, who might now have pushed their frontier forward in this direction for an immense distance, had the king cared to follow up his victory, but he contented himself with merely accepting the oaths of submission of the chiefs in the immediate neighborhood, and then returned to Kumasi. During this reign, a civil war broke out between Mampon and Jabin, in which the latter was defeated. The two kings were then sent for by Osei Kujo, who inquired into the dispute and gave judgment in favor of Mampon. Sefri was also subjugated at about this time, and its king, Buman Kuma, or Abirimoro, was killed. A new king now came to the throne of Dahomey, and seeing the rapid extension of the Ashanti Empire and the steady growth of its power, seems to have been afraid another attempt might soon be made to avenge the defeat of Osei Kwesi. He therefore sent a friendly embassy to Kumasi to announce his accession and bear presents and a complimentary message to the Ashanti king. These ambassadors were well entertained, and the compliment was soon afterwards returned by the dispatch of a similar mission to the court at Abomi. According to Quickshank, it was during Kujo's reign that the first mention of Ashanti occurred in the records at Cape Coast Castle. On the 10th of July, 1765, and again in 1767 and 1772. The council took into consideration the probability of hostilities arising between the Ashantis and Fantis, and in 1767 asked for men of war to be stationed on the coast until affairs became more settled. They feared that if the Ashantis proved victorious, their settlements might be endangered, while, should the Fantis conquer, it was expected that the company's trade would be ruined. Osei Kujo was now getting very old and infirm, and seldom left the palace. This gave rise to false reports of his death, which encouraged the Essenes, Akims, and Aquapims once more to revolt. They now sent insulting and defiant messages to Kumasi. Kujo sent ordering them to keep the peace, but they murdered his messengers and derisively threatened to march to the capital and place one of their women slaves on the stool. She, they said, would soon reduce the haughty Ashanti chiefs to a more becoming state of humility and subjection. Great preparations were at once made for war, but before they could be completed, Osei Kujo died in 1781 and was succeeded by his great-nephew Kwamina, who was a mere boy still in his teens. In the meantime, the annual allowance that had been voted by Parliament to the Royal African Company in 1730 had been regularly paid down to the year 1747, when nothing was granted. In 1744, however, it had been doubled on account of the wars with France and Spain, and the payments had since been regularly made. Although these grants were very insufficient, they, and some improvement in the trade that followed the French war, enabled the company to hold out until 1750, when an act was passed by which the charter, lands, forts, and other property of the Royal African Company were surrendered after due compensation, and vested in a new company called the African Company of Merchants. The new company continued to receive an allowance of from £10,000 to £15,000 a year from Parliament for the maintenance of its forts, and its membership was open to all British merchants on payment of a fee of £2. During the 7 Years' War in 1757, the French made an unsuccessful attempt to capture Cape Coast Castle. The enemy's fleet, which consisted of 2 ships of the line and a large frigate, was commanded by de Kersaint, and immediately on its arrival, the governor, Mr. Charles Bell, collected about 50 Europeans from the vessels then on the coast to reinforce his garrison, and mounted a few extra guns on a temporary battery. The townspeople also raised a force of 1,200 men. When the French fleet opened fire, the castle guns immediately replied, and poured so well directed and steady a fire into the enemy's ships that after an action that only lasted 2 hours, they were driven off and sailed away to the West Indies without having been able to do any material damage to the fortress. The long continuance of the war, however, prevented the usual supplies reaching the coast, and the garrison would have been reduced to great straits for provisions had not the local chief Brempen Cujo sent them food. In recognition of this service, 2 silver goblets, suitably inscribed, were presented to him after the war, and still form part of the store property of Cape Coast. About this time, the Dutch, who for some years past had been trying to establish their authority in Apollonia to the exclusion of the English, raised a mixed force of Europeans and Africans, and taking a few guns with them, crossed the river Ancobra and invaded the district. They were soon met and defeated by the inhabitants under their chief Ammonihia, who took their artillery and drove them back across the river. Soon afterwards, Ammonihia, hearing that they were preparing to attack him again, invited the English to build a fort in his country. They accordingly built a small fort at Bayin, thereby securing the whole of the Apollonian trade and extending their influence as far as the river Tano. This Ammonihia was a man of great courage and determination, though inclined to be boastful and tyrannical. It is recorded of him that, being annoyed by the depredations of a leopard which had evaded every attempt to destroy it, he called his chiefs together and gave orders for the bush in which it lay concealed to be surrounded and the animal captured and brought to him alive, adding that he was quite prepared to risk the loss of half his subjects in order to accomplish his purpose. Strange to say, this extraordinary order was promptly carried out, and though several persons lost their lives and others were badly mauled, the animal was eventually secured and dragged before the chief, who kept it tied to a stake in the courtyard of his house, where he was in the habit of pointing to it as evidence of his power and supremacy over everything in his kingdom, even to the wild beasts. Ammonihia was succeeded by a man named Kwashi, who made himself an object of dread and aversion to all his subjects by his despotic rule and many cruelties, though when he died in June 1801, he was as much beloved as he had at one time been hated. This change was brought about in the following manner. 3 children were born to him, all of whom were deaf mutes, which so puzzled him that he inquired of everyone what could be the explanation of such a misfortune. Finally he was told, after giving assurances that he would not be displeased if the real reason were made known to him, that the affliction had been caused by the fetish as a punishment for his cruel government, and that even worse calamities would follow if he persisted in his present line of conduct. This alarming statement had such an effect on Kwashi that he thereafter governed his people in the mildest manner and never failed to consult his chiefs and be guided by them in every matter of importance. On the death of Kwashi, there was no heir apparent in the direct line of succession, brother or nephew, and his eldest son Suki was therefore chosen king, but was at once opposed by his younger brother Anahoma, who compelled him to fly to the forest. Anahoma's adherents, however, deserted him soon afterwards and joined the forces under Suki, who then advanced against the usurper. Anahoma, finding himself without men and unable to make any further resistance, threw all his gold and valuables into the lagoon, collecting his wives and family, took them into the forest, where he killed all but one son, whom he spared to help him in burying the bodies. This done, he committed suicide, or, as some say, compelled his son to shoot him. Suki afterwards discovered where the bodies were buried and caused them to be exhumed and brought down to the beach, where they were set up in a long row supported by stakes. This ghastly spectacle was left as a warning to all rebels until the bodies were finally disintegrated. A little later, the people, disgusted by the acts of Suki, killed him and all Kwashi's children, with the exception of 2 of the deaf mutes, who still survived but were deemed incapable of intriguing to disturb the peace of the kingdom. The stool was then given to an old man, who acted as regent. On the 20th of December 1780, England declared war on Holland, and a few months later, early in 1781, an unsuccessful attempt was made to capture Elmina. The plan of operations comprised a simultaneous attack by sea and land. The ships were to bombard the castle while the troops stormed Fort Conradsburg. The naval force consisted of HMS Leander, a 50-gun ship under Captain Shirley, and a sloop of war, while the troops were commanded by Captain Mackenzie and numbered between 400 and 500 men, of whom 300 were natives, and the remainder soldiers in the service of the company of merchants and seamen who had been landed from the warships to assist them. The plan failed miserably for want of cooperation between the 2 commanders, which must be attributed either to gross lack of judgment or more probably to jealousy. Captain Mackenzie received no support whatever from the men of war while he was making his attack on Fort Conradsburg, and this naturally destroyed his chances of success, and he was driven back. It was only after his defeat that Captain Shirley began to bombard the castle, and was in turn repulsed. The Dutch had a decided advantage in being able to devote their whole attention to each party singly, though it is doubtful if the English force was really strong enough to have captured such a fortress as Elmina, even had the original plan been carried out. But though they were worsted at Elmina, the English got the best of the Dutch in several other places. In the following year, 1782, HMS Argo arrived on the coast, and thus reinforced, Captain Shirley captured the Dutch forts at Moree, Appam, Cormantin, and Beracoo, all of which were very poorly garrisoned and offered but a feeble resistance, while Governor Mills, assisted by 50 men from the Argo, took Fort Vredenburg at Comenda. The ships then sailed down to Accra to attack Fort Crèvecoeur. A determined and prolonged resistance was offered by the Dutch Accras, while the fort was bombarded by the ships and James Fort. In the end, the Accras were driven into the bush, but it is uncertain whether the fort itself was ever taken. Presumably, it must have fallen after the flight of the Accras, and Meredith distinctly states that it was captured. Rheindorf, on the other hand, says that the garrison had been greatly reduced on account of the war in Europe, and that only the commandant and a few native soldiers remained. Reinforcements from Winneba and other places were drafted into British Accra, and strongly advised the people of the Dutch town to leave the place instead of attempting to oppose the English. They, however, were determined to defend the fort, and collected as large a force as possible from Teshi, Ningo, and other towns, while the people of Christiansborg, being Danish subjects, had of course to remain neutral. He says that while the ships and Fort James bombarded Fort Crèvecoeur, a battle was fought on the ground between the 2 forts between the Marines and English allies and the people of the Dutch town and their allies. The fighting lasted from dawn till dusk, for 24 days, until the Dutch Acras at length became so exhausted and so short of ammunition that they were compelled to relinquish the struggle and retired to the bush. According to this writer, the fort was never taken, though it suffered considerable damage from the bombardment. The only success scored by the Dutch during this war was the capture of the English fort at Secondi, which they completely destroyed. Captain Kenneth Mackenzie, an officer commanding an independent company in the service of the Company of Merchants, was commandant of Fort Nassau at Moree while it was in the possession of the English. This was the same Captain Mackenzie who had led the attack against Fort Conradsburg in 1781. The garrison at Moree, as at the other English posts, consisted largely of convicts who had been sent out to serve in the company's forces on the Gold Coast, and the proportion of these to volunteers was 16 to 5. Among these convicts was a man named Kenneth Murray Mackenzie, a nephew of the commandant, who had formerly been a drummer in the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards, but having on at least 3 occasions been sentenced to death for robbery and reprieved, and indicted for several other burglaries and thefts and acquitted through non-appearance of the prosecution. He had eventually been transported to Africa and drafted into the service of the company. Ever since his arrival on the coast, his conduct had been notoriously bad, and he had twice deserted and more than once been guilty of insubordination. He was, moreover, strongly suspected of being in the pay of the Dutch and of conspiring to murder Captain Mackenzie and surrender the fort to them. At one time he had acted as adjutant, but having committed some fresh breach of discipline, was placed under open arrest and confined to barracks. On the 3rd of August, 1782, he came down to the gate and persuaded the sentry, Brooks, to let him pass, saying he only wished to speak to one of the Moreys and arrange with him to get him some brandy, and promising to return within a few minutes. This, however, he failed to do, and when it was found, he had already sent a bundle of clothes away by a native. Little doubt was entertained that he had deserted to the Dutch. The unfortunate Brooks was tied up from 7 o'clock until 1, and was computed to have received about 1,500 lashes, while Captain Mackenzie sent Sergeant Andrews and 2 men to find and bring back the deserter. They went as far as Cape Coast without seeing or hearing anything of him, and then turned back to Moree, as they were afraid to go any farther, lest they themselves should be captured by the Dutch from Elmina. On their return, it was decided that the man must still be hiding in Moree, where the people were well known to be friendly with the Dutch, and Captain Mackenzie, without warning the chief or making any inquiries, caused 2 6-pounders to be fired into the town. The Moreys at once fled into the bush, but returned the next morning and surrendered the runaway. He denied any intention of deserting, but said he had gone to the village and, having got drunk and fallen asleep in the garden, had been seen and seized by the Moreys as he was making his way back to the fort later in the day. Captain Mackenzie, however, refused to listen to any explanations, and within an hour of his surrender, caused him to be executed without any form of trial whatever. He was seated in one of the embrasures in front of a loaded gun, and his hands and legs were then made fast to it above and below. One of the men read part of the burial service to him, and Captain Mackenzie, after producing his own nightcap to be pulled over his head, gave the signal for the gun to be fired. The man was killed instantly, and his body, which had been blown clear over the battlements, was picked up later and buried by some of the garrison. For this act, Captain Mackenzie was brought to England to take his trial at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Wills on the 10th of December 1784. The rather curious indictment was as follows. Kenneth Mackenzie was indicted by the name of Kenneth Mackenzie, late of London, Esquire, for that he, not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, on the 4th day of August, in the 22nd year of his present Majesty's reign, with force of arms at Fort Maria, on the coast of Africa, in parts beyond the seas, in and upon Kenneth Murray Mackenzie, feloniously, wilfully, and of his malice, a forethought did make an assault, and that he a certain great gun, called a cannon, value 20 shillings, then and there charged with gunpowder and 1 iron ball, did discharge and shoot off to, against, and upon the said Kenneth Murray Mackenzie, and by the said iron ball, so shot off and discharged from the said cannon as aforesaid, wilfully, and of his malice a forethought, did strike, penetrate, and wound the said Kenneth Murray Mackenzie, giving to him on the left side of the belly 1 mortal wound, of the length of 6 inches, and of the breadth of 3 inches, of which he then and there instantly died, and so the jurors say that he, in a manner and form aforesaid, then and there did kill and murder him, the said Kenneth Murray Mackenzie. For the defence, it was argued that the deceased was a desperate character and was conspiring against the accused, whose life was threatened, and that it was absolutely necessary, in view of the number of convicts in the garrison, to make an example of him. The judge, in summing up, pointed out that such an execution without trial was not in accordance with martial or any other law, but, though he touched on the fact that there was a safe prison at Cape Coast, left the question of justification on the ground of self-defense to the jury. They found the prisoner guilty, but recommended him to mercy, and he was sentenced to death. He was afterwards reprieved, partly on account of the great gallantry he had shown in Guernsey when the French attacked the Channel Islands in 1778, but although he received His Majesty's pardon for the murder, he was still detained in Newgate prison to answer a charge of piracy which the Portuguese ambassador had lodged against him for having cut out from under the guns of a Dutch fort a Portuguese ship sailing under Dutch colours. The government in the meantime kept £11,000 worth of gold dust belonging to him until he gave an account of the stores, etc., that he had in his charge, but what eventually became of this enterprising but reckless man is not known. On the conclusion of peace in 1785, all the forts that had changed hands during the Anglo-Dutch War were restored to those who had held them at its commencement. Since the sale of Fort Fredericksburg to the English in 1685, the Dutch had made no attempt to form any fresh settlements, with the exception of a small fort that they had built in 1734 at Ningo, about 35 miles to the east of Christiansborg, which they called Friedensborg, but wishing now to extend their influence and trade, which had been greatly interfered with by continual intertribal wars, and not caring to risk disputes with the other Europeans, they decided to exploit the still unoccupied eastward coast. In 1784, they built a square fort with 4 bastions and mounting 24 guns at Adder, which they named Konigstein. But before they could form any further settlements on this part of the coast, it was necessary to subdue the Arunas. This unruly tribe had, for a long time, been at almost constant war with the Adas. these wars arose from a variety of causes, but were principally due to disputes about the fishing rights of the two tribes in the river Volta or to panyaring. Quarrels had also arisen over the collection of salt in the lagoons, and the alliance of the Adas with the Akras provided yet another cause of enmity. A great war had broken out between the two tribes in 1750 and lasted for many years. The Adas had then been assisted by the Akims and Akwapims and had eventually overcome the Arunas. The latter, however, had taken the two kings prisoners, and it was not until 1767 that peace had been made and the royal captives ransomed. The Arunas had again assumed the offensive in 1776, and the slaughter during this war had been appalling, more than half the population being killed. The Danes, therefore, determined to make a great effort to crush these people once and for all, and in 1783 an army raised by Major Kyogi in Christiansborg and Accra, and reinforced by the Adas, Akwapims, and others, was sent across the Volta for this purpose. The Arunas were defeated, and a treaty was concluded on the 18th of June 1784, by which they agreed to the erection of a fort at Kita and factories elsewhere in their country, and guaranteed the safety of traders. By virtue of this treaty, a fort which had already begun at Kita was completed and occupied the same year, and named Prinsenstein. It mounted 8 brass 3-pounders. The Danes also built a redoubt called Augustaberg at Teshi in 1787 and mounted it with 16 guns. Fort Vernon at Prampram was built by the English at about the same time. It soon fell into ruins, however, and a second building that was raised on the same site in 1806, being built with more haste than care, was soon in a similar condition. The Danes devoted a great deal of attention to agriculture and had several excellent plantations. One at the foot of the Akwapi Mountains was known as Frederiksgower, another near Akopong as Frederiksnopel, and a third at Todowa as Fredrikstad. In 1798, a botanical expert, P. Tonning, was sent out by the Danish government to examine and report upon the agricultural possibilities of their possessions. They were particularly successful in the cultivation of coffee, but this part of the country was unfortunately overrun during the wars that broke out a few years later, and the plantations were ruined. Osai Kwamina, on his accession in 1781, swore that he would neither enter his palace nor see his wives until he had avenged the insult that had been offered to his predecessor by the Essenes, Akims, and other rebels by bringing the heads of the leaders of the revolt to Kumasi. He quickly joined the army, and Akim was invaded by forced marches. The rebellious tribes were taken by surprise and defeated, and Ofusu, the king of Akim, and Akombra, a Buromi chief, were killed and their heads brought to the capital. Embassies then arrived from Dahomey, from Falaga, and from Yendi, congratulating the king on his accession to the stool and his triumph over his enemies. According to Bowditch, there was another war with Banda during this reign, and its king, Ogdrasi, finding he must inevitably fall into the hands of the Ashantis, preferred to commit suicide. He left orders that a pregnant woman should be sacrificed, her belly ripped up and his head soon inside it to save it from being taken as a trophy by the enemy. In spite of these precautions, however, the head was found, and the skull afterwards became one of the principal ornaments of the king's drums. Dupuis, however, denies that there was ever any war with Banda during Kwamina's reign, and declares this story to be without foundation. Insuta and Ikoranza, however, who had tried to assert their independence, were both subjugated. In 1792, the Danish governor of Christiansborg, Andreas Bjorn, found himself in difficulties with the Popos, and so great had the fame of the Ashantis as a race of warriors now become, that he applied to the king for 5,000 auxiliaries. The English, alarmed at the prospect of an Ashanti army being marched down to the coast, sent messengers to Osai Kwamina begging him to refuse, but they met with no success and found the Ashantis making great preparations for war. Governor Bjorn, however, was succeeded by Andreas Hammer, who was rather diffident about entangling himself in any such alliance, and sent 250 ounces of gold to purchase the return of the army, which was already on its way to the coast. The dispatch of these messengers to Osai Kwamina constitutes the first record of any intercourse between the English and the Ashanti court. Osai Kwamina, who was the most merciful of all the Ashanti kings, now became the victim of a conspiracy amongst his own chiefs, which soon afterwards led to his disdolment. He is believed to have been secretly converted to the Mohammedan faith and to have meditated the introduction of the Quranic law into his kingdom. Bowditch further asserts that he neglected all the affairs of state for not less than 12 months while he stayed at Jabin, paying his attentions to the king's daughter, Giawa, with whom he was infatuated. Towards the end of his reign, he prohibited a great many of the customary human sacrifices, reserving this right almost exclusively for the use at funeral customs, and these innovations, combined with the fear of what else he might do in the future, led the chiefs to depose him in 1797. He was given a few of his wives and slaves and sent into retirement in the bush, where he was put to death a few years later at his own request and by the following peculiar method. His feet were made fast to the ground, and he was then bent backwards over a prop on which his body rested, while some heavy elephant's tusks were hung by a cord from his neck and strangled him. These strange means were adopted in order to avoid the unlawful shedding of royal blood. Kwamina was succeeded by his brother Osai Opoku II. He was almost immediately involved in another war with the Jamans, who, at the instigation of Kong, had seized the opportunity of the late king's deposition to rebel, pretending that they had wished to restore him to the stool and threatening to march to Kumasi for this purpose. The Jamans, who were joined by a large army from Kong and crossing the river Tano, invaded Ashanti territory. Opoki at first acted on the defensive, but on being joined by the tributary forces from Jabin, Inkaransa and Banda, gave battle on the banks of the river near Barbanu. The engagement lasted for several days, but the Jamans were eventually defeated, although their army is said to have outnumbered the Ashanti force by 4-1. This war with Jaman lasted altogether for 15 months, and great numbers of prisoners and large quantities of plunder were brought back to Kumasi, the Mohammedan prisoners alone numbering over 5,000. Opoku did not long survive this victory, but died in 1799 after a lingering illness which was commonly attributed to the practice of witchcraft by the deposed king. He was succeeded in 1800 by a third brother, Osai Tutu Kwamina, also known as Asibi or Bonsu, the greatest ruler who ever sat upon the Ashanti stool. From some correspondence in one of the old, but unfortunately very incomplete, letterbooks at Christiansborg Castle, it appears that the French had formed a small settlement by about 1788 at a place not far from Anamabo, the name of which is given as Amaku. The French commandant's name was Mugin, and he had a surgeon with him named Mallet. but the vessel that had brought them to the coast had evidently left them without stores for only a short time, and no more were sent out, probably owing to the wars that followed the French Revolution. Governor Dalzell was, of course, most anxious to turn out these intruders, but though prisoners were occasionally taken and deserters sometimes gave themselves up at Anamabo, he did not feel strong enough with a small force at his command to attack them. In June 1794, however, negotiations were opened with Amonu Kuma, the king of Anamabo, for the neutrality of the Fantis, and he was told that the whole Fanti nation would be held responsible for any hostile act committed against the English or Dutch troops that were to be sent against Amoku, while the payment of a monthly subsidy to the Amoku chiefs was suggested if they too would side against the French. These negotiations secured the neutrality of the Fantis, but those with the Amokus were evidently abortive, for on the 15th of June, Mr. Gordon, the commandant of Anamabo, reported to the governor that the commandant of the French settlement answered the summons last night, wherein he says that he is of the old constitution in France, and that not having received any supplies from Europe for 4 years and a half, he would surrender, but the natives will not permit him, adding that as a royalist he had hoisted the white flag of France. The governor replied that the question whether the French were royalists or democrats did not affect his demand for the surrender and destruction of the settlement, since it had been built on British soil and in defiance of the company's treaties with the Fantis, but that if they could prove themselves royalists, their persons and property would be protected. The French at this time were in great straits, and the opposition of the Amokus to their departure was due to their being heavily in debt to them. At one time, indeed, they were so reduced that they sent to Anamabo begging to be allowed to buy 4 akis worth of biscuit. A little biscuit, all that there was in the store, was sent to them and the gold returned. After the negotiations had dragged on for several months, it was eventually agreed that the French should surrender themselves at Anamabo with any property they could save, and be subsisted by the governor at Cape Coast until he could procure them a passage to the West Indies, that they should be treated as loyal subjects of Louis XVIII, and that the question of possession of the settlement should be decided by the respective powers on the conclusion of peace. This plan was to have been carried out on the night of the 19th of October, and Mugin was advised to send his slaves on ahead on pretense of selling them to get money to pay his liabilities to the Amoki chiefs. At the last moment, however, he wrote saying that the plan was too dangerous, and begged to be allowed to leave his property and slaves at Amoku, evidently thinking that he and his men would be fortunate if they escaped with their lives. There is no further record, but it is probable that the men either did escape or were killed in the attempt, or, if they could hold out long enough, they may have been rescued by some French ships that came down a little later. On the 3rd of December, Governor Van der Grip reported that 5 French ships had been sighted to the west of Elmina. These were the Experiment, 50 guns, Vigilant, 26 guns, Félicité, 20 guns, and 2 brigs, one of which carried 12 24-pounders and the other 12 12-pounders. They had an English 20-gun ship with them, the Harpy of London, which they had captured and were using as a hospital ship. An urgent warning was at once sent out to every fort to prepare for defense, and on the following day 2 of the ships and a brig, La Mutine, attacked Anamabo, but after a deal of noise and vast fatigue, were repulsed, though Mr. Gordon complained bitterly to the governor of the quantity of liquor he had been compelled to give the Fanties to keep up their courage. The brig also fired 2 shots into Cormanton as she passed. The English officers declared that the enemy was strong enough to take every fort they possessed if only they chose to exert themselves, for there was hardly any ammunition in the magazines and the natives were utterly unreliable. 2 days later, however, the French burned a Portuguese prize off a Croix and then sailed away to leeward without firing another shot. Ever since the Dutch drove the Portuguese off the coast, they had claimed a duty from all Portuguese ships arriving there, no matter for what port they might be bound, and compelled them to anchor at Elmina to pay it. If one ship refused to stop and thus evaded the payment, the next to arrive was made to pay for both. In 1796, a Portuguese vessel anchored off Cape Coast without having complied with this regulation, and the Dutch governor sent over an armed party, who compelled her captain and crew to come ashore and made them all prisoners. This insult, however, was not allowed to pass unnoticed by the English, and Governor Dalzell remonstrated so strongly that he not only secured the release of the prisoners and an apology, but compelled the Dutch to waive this claim in future in the case the ships did not wish to call at a Dutch port. Now that another century had elapsed, great changes had taken place in the native states. Ashanti, which at the commencement of Osei Tutu's reign had consisted merely of the country in the immediate neighbourhood of Kumasi, now ruled over a vast extent of the country. In Karanza, Banda, Jaman, Wasau, Sefwi, Dankara, Tufel, Awawin, Tekiman, Asin, Akim, Akwapim, Kwahu, and Akwamu all owed allegiance to its king. It is true that this great empire was but loosely bound together and that there were frequent rebellions, calling for constant activity on the part of the Ashantis in order to maintain their position. This was due to the one great fault of their administration. Though they could conquer, they could not govern. In fact, they never made any serious attempt to do so. On the reduction of a new state and its inclusion as a province of the empire, no army of occupation was left, but the district was handed over to one of the Ashanti chiefs as governor or resident, and beyond the payment of an annual tribute and the rendering of military service when called upon, nothing was required. The amount of tribute payable by these provinces was in some cases fixed and in others left indefinite. The amount actually levied depended on the exigencies of the state and its varying needs for war or other purposes. Those provinces whose soil was auriferous paid in gold. Others, in which gold was not found, were taxed by towns according to their size and importance, paying tribute in cattle, slaves, etc. Thus Sefri paid 200 pereduines, or £2,000, annually. Monsi, Adansi, 50 benders, £450, and Jaman 100 pereduines, £1,000. Salaga and the other large Dagomba towns were assessed at 500 slaves, 200 cows, 400 sheep, 400 cotton cloths, and 200 silk and cotton cloths. The so-called residents seldom lived in their districts, but stayed in Kumasi, and only went to the provinces nominally under their control when the tribute was to be collected, or on other special occasions. The Ashanti Empire, therefore, though extensive, lacked cohesion, and each province being left practically under the rule of its own chiefs, seized upon the first opportunity to rebel as soon as it felt strong enough. Had the Ashantis possessed half as much talent for government and organization as they had for making conquests, it is difficult to imagine to what extent their power might have grown. On the Gold Coast itself, too, there were further changes. Ashanti, once a small state, had now, by mingled diplomacy and force, subjected its neighbours until its country extended from the Sweet River to Bereku. The whole of this territory, however, was not ruled over by one man. The king of Abra was its nominal head, but in practice the government was administered by a federation of several more or less independent kings and chiefs, each of whom ruled over his own district, but made his local policy subservient to the general interest. The forts, as has been seen, were held primarily for the purpose of carrying on the slave trade, and the ground rent secured by monthly pay notes was paid to the chiefs. The English, up to this time, had made no attempt to exercise any jurisdiction over the people, nor to improve their condition by education or other means. Strictly speaking, of course, they had absolutely no right to interfere with them. They were merely tenants and had no concern in their landlord's business. It was only when their own convenience or property was threatened by the outbreak of intertribal wars and the consequent interruption to trade that they took any action and made occasional attempts at mediation. And it was not until many years later that the inevitable consequences of the long association of two races so far apart in the scale of civilization began to make themselves felt. Cruikshank gives an excellent idea of the relations that existed between the European settlers and the coast peoples at this time. The native, keenly alive to his interests, supple and fawning, readily acknowledged the superiority of the white man in words, and hailed him, without any scruples of pride, as his master. But he had, and ever has had, a reservation in his own mind which limits the signification of the term to his own construction of it, and has no more intention of giving implicit obedience, if he can help himself, when his pleasure and profit appear to him to be compromised, than if he had never entered into any undertaking upon the subject. Neither would he wish to shake himself free from the necessity of obedience. His object is to endeavour, on all occasions, to magnify the sacrifice which he is making to gratify your wishes, not so much from a determination not to obey them, as to obtain some bribe or concession for his obedience. A service of this description appears to have been the nature of the dependence of the African upon the European on the Gold Coast from their earliest intercourse. It has certainly given rise to an incessant struggle, productive of every species of artifice on both sides, in the attempts of the one party to extend their power and influence, and of the other to obtain new privileges. The relation in which they stood to each other never, in fact, appears to have been clearly defined or understood. Indeed, it is possible neither party wished it to be so, as any certainty upon the point would lessen the probability of advantages which might possibly turn up in the chapter of accidents. Thus, though nominally masters, the English really had no authority whatever, and the supply of slaves being entirely in the hands of the people, who well understood the advantage they held, led them to raise frequent disputes and obstructions to the trade, with the object of obtaining some advantage as the price of peace. And although the English had from time to time made attempts to resist these extortions, yet the natives had invariably triumphed. So outrageous did the conduct of the people of the Cape Coast eventually become, that they not only insulted but actually assaulted in the streets officers of ships, merchants, and even officers of the company. In 1802, they handled the captain of an English ship so roughly that he died soon afterwards. But this seems at last to have convinced the governor that there must be no more trifling, and the English then began to show a more determined spirit. The chiefs and headmen were summoned to the castle, and an agreement was then drawn up by which it was arranged that any outrage against Europeans should render the people liable to a fine of 40 ounces of gold, and that all complaints against Europeans should be laid before the governor under a similar penalty. But although these terms were agreed to at the time and publicly proclaimed, it was not long before they were violated and a great riot took place. In 1803, Mr. John Swansea, a trader living in the town, complained to the governor that one of his gold takers had accepted false gold. These gold takers were employed by traders to weigh and test the gold bought by their customers in payment for goods, and were required to replace any base metal taken by them. Mr. Swansea employed 2 of these men, and the gold therefore had to be passed by them both. A man had come to buy cloth, and had paid 8 accies, or £2, while one of the gold takers was out, and Mr. Swansea had ordered the man who was on duty not to mix this gold with that already taken until the other had returned and passed it also. On the arrival of the second gold taker, 2/3 of this gold was found to be base metal, and the man who had taken it had then run away and could not now be found. It would clearly have been useless to take this case before the chief's court, for it involved the question of cheating the white man, and African and European alike had been accustomed to regard this cheating of each other as their rightful prerogative. As the delinquent gold taker could not now be found, the man who had bought the cloth and who was suspected of being an accomplice was brought to the castle as security for his appearance. This man happened to be a person of some importance in the town, and no sooner had he been secured than a great crowd, armed with guns and swords, assembled in front of Mr. Swansea's house, which was just in front of the castle gate and within 50 yards of it, demanding the instant release of the prisoner. The governor, Mr. Jacob Mould, sent out a message ordering the people to disperse, but they only replied with insults and defiance, and openly challenged the garrison to come out and fight them. The mob now threatened to attack Mr. Swansea, who was preparing to defend the property in his house. At their first attempt, they broke in the front gate, but finding the occupants ready to oppose them, quickly retreated. Soon afterwards, a party was seen trying to force an entrance at the back of the premises in order to take the defenders by surprise, and Mr. Mould then released the prisoner, who was carried off in triumph by his friends. This tame submission on the part of the governor by no means pleased his officers, who at once drew up and delivered to him a very strong-worded protest. This had the desired effect. Mr. Mould immediately gave orders for the guns commanding the town to be loaded, and made every preparation to punish the people for their violent and unreasonable conduct, while a message was sent to the chiefs demanding payment of 40 ounces of gold under their agreement. This, however, was defiantly refused, and time then had to be given to allow the Europeans living in the town to remove their property to the castle. While this was being done, the people busied themselves with their own preparations, collecting all their removable property and sending it, together with the old men, women and children, to the bush villages. As soon as everything was ready, 2 guns were fired over the town, but failed to produce the submission of the people, and the bombardment was then commenced in earnest. Fires soon broke out in several quarters and destroyed the greater part of the town before they could be extinguished, and the people then began firing into the castle from some houses standing close in front of it which had escaped the conflagration. The balls from the castle guns had very little effect on the mud walls of these houses. but either remained embedded in them or dropped harmlessly on the other side. The people, on the other hand, being under cover, were comparatively safe from small arm fire, though their muskets could tell against the men who were working the guns. The struggle continued in this way for nearly a month, but the people then asked for a truce, and after some tedious negotiations, security was given for the payment of a penalty, and the opportune arrival of HMS Romney finally brought this little war to a close. About this time, too, another dispute arose between the English and the Anamabos on account of an attempt by the commandant to put a stop to the commission of nuisances under the walls of the fort, and a fight ensued, which lasted for 3 days, during which the greater part of the town was destroyed and several lives were lost. From these incidents it will be seen how little authority the English really had, and how strictly that was confined to the forts themselves. Considering the class of men who were employed by the company and the truly extraordinary ideas of justice that these officials seemed to have held, it is not surprising that the people showed themselves thus restless and turbulent. Cruikshank, who had access to the records in Cape Coast Castle that have since been destroyed, gives several instances illustrating the spirit in which these men regarded the people and the manner in which they were accustomed to treat them. One officer at Winneba wrote complaining of an affront he had received from a man there, saying, "I seized a musket and made a rush at him, but the villain had the audacity to elude the bayonet," while a commandant of Reda, where the company had a fort, seized a quantity of goods from a schooner in the roads and justified his action by saying the vessel was from the island of St. Thomas, and the man at Prince's Island owed him a debt. As an example of illiteracy, a commandant of Comenda wrote in explanation of the inefficiency of his garrison, "They are all sick, not from any acute distemporary disorders, but from old chronical ones. Even the highest officials seem to have had most distorted ideas of justice and protection," for the following minute appeared in the Council Book of May 1802, signed by a governor and other members of the council. A free family from Great Cormentine, consisting of 2 males and 9 females, having claimed the company's protection, saying they were free people without any man to defend them, in consequence of which they had been exposed to many vexatious palavers, and that several of their relatives had already been paniarded and sold. The council, having taken the case into consideration, ordered them to be incorporated with the company's slaves. Signed Archibald Dalzell, Jacob Mould, and Henry Hamilton. The climate, always bad, at times played frightful havoc amongst the Europeans, and in some specially bad years the death rate among them was simply appalling. Thus in 1756, Governor Melville and nearly the whole of the officers and garrison of Cape Coast succumbed to it. So bad was it, in fact, that Dr. Lind wrote that the living was scarce sufficient to remove and bury the dead. Other exceptionally bad years were 1763, 1769, and 1775.